This is the second in our series of short lectures to coincide with the run-up of the 75th anniversary of the Reading Dusseldorf Association. In the first talk, I explored the background and context of the relationship, and that covered the contribution made by the British Army and the civil administration to the reconstruction of Germany just after the war in 1945. In this second talk, I want to focus on the origin of the Reading Dusseldorf Association, and in particular the work of the Mayor of Reading at the time in 1946, Cllr Phoebe Cusden. I want to expand somewhat in the context of the time as to why she felt it was necessary and appropriate to do as she did and provide aid to the people of Dusseldorf. And so to help me answer those questions and explore what Phoebe got up to, I'm delighted to welcome our guest speaker, Dr Ute Wolfel.
Hello.
Ute. So a brief CV of Ute. She grew up in what people of my generation remember as East Berlin and studied at the Humboldt University in the centre of Berlin, where she studied German, English and American literature. And then she came to the United Kingdom. She's now an associate professor at the University of Reading in the Department of Language and Culture. She teaches German history, literature and film studies, and she's worked and published widely on 20th century German literature and culture, particularly on East German matters. She has several research projects on 20th century war films, which included a focus on the depiction and the role of child figures in Germany and other European films of the immediate post-war period. And it's that link really that's brought her towards the Reading Dusseldorf Association and her interest in Phoebe Cusden. So again, an ideal speaker for our series, Ute. So perhaps I will just paint the picture again, picking up from our last talk, about the state of Dusseldorf in 1945-46. And we know it was in a pretty dire straits. It had been very much the subject of a massive bombing campaign by the RAF, particularly in July 43, the Battle of the Ruhr, and in 44. And by the time that the American troops entered Dusseldorf in April 45, it was a very badly bombed city. About 93% of the houses were uninhabitable. The British then took over, and they started to see what they could do to help repair the city. And we'll hear also about, again in our talk here, about how many people were living in dire situation with very little food, living in ruins, in cellars. And indeed, there was a very great concern that the whole thing would collapse, that the disease would become rife. Thankfully, it didn't. And so to start off, Ute, can you tell us, how was it that people in England, back in Britain, actually then got to hear about this?
So there was a widespread debate in the British press about the zone of occupation and the dire living conditions, and particularly the lack of food. And one of the central contributors to this debate was Victor Gollancz, the publisher and human rights campaigner. And he went to Germany, to the British zone of occupation in autumn 46, October, November, for 6 weeks, and traveling through the whole zone, but particularly Düsseldorf and Hamburg, where he spent a lot of time. And he reported back to all the major British newspapers like The Times, Manchester Guardian, The Observer, The New Statesman, and so on, in articles and letters reporting back on what he saw.
And the papers were publishing them, because you can imagine
they did publish,
that they weren't interested in fact what was going on in Germany. They were worried about affairs at home, but they were being published.
No, they did publish, and there were also smaller debates ensuing from the letters he wrote. So he sent one letter and complained about the policy of the British government, who had promised the British public what we'd probably call a Christmas hamper. So obviously the British didn't have enough food, and it was rationed. And with the new Minister of Food coming in May 46, the first thing introduced were bread rationings.
Yes.
And it seems that, sort of as to counterbalance this, the government promised luxury goods for Christmas and promised to import turkey and chicken and other poultry and sweets.
Yeah.
And Gollange got very angry about this, saying, so people in Germany live on half the rations that the British have to begin with, and now we top up our own, and to look forward to a nice Christmas.
Yes.
Whereas what I found in Germany are people starving, being ill with hunger, kids who come to school with not a single breadcrumb for breakfast.
Yes.
So that's immoral.
Right.
We should start thinking about the others. They should get these additional meat rations, not us.
Yes.
And that then elicited a reply from the Minister of Food, which was actually an old friend and political ally of Gollange, Evelyn John Starchy.
Yeah.
And he said, that's ridiculous, and yeah.
So I think we heard last time that actually there was actually bread rationing in the United Kingdom, not because there needed to be, but actually then they could divert food supplies to Germany. Is that right?
If that is right, they couldn't distribute it properly. So I know they had difficulties getting the food to the people, and they also had difficulties protecting the food.
In Germany?
In Germany, yeah.
Yes, you can imagine that anything that's moved, people would be trying to steal it just to survive, plus a black market.
And in 46, all the pictures we get, so not just from Gollange, there were others reporting back, and also others that Phoebe Cusden had contacts to, like a woman working for the British Red Cross, Susie Skevington, wrote back, and they all reported on how little people had to live on. Yes.
And it's just to think about today's audience, today's news media, it's global, we know what's happening anywhere in the world at the moment. Then, of course, it was much more restricted, there were far fewer people travelling, they were very limited sources of information, so you were much more dependent on reporters going out. So you mentioned Gollange was one. There were others. One of the ones most relevant to Reading, and who is this?
Yes,
the Major General.
Major General Collins.
Tell us about him.
So yes, he retired from the Royal Berkshire Regiment, exactly, and he also he was in Germany at the same time Gollange was there in November 46. And he was not, like Gollange, a left-wing human rights campaigner, and yet still he was as shocked as Gollange at what he found. And it seems that when he came back, he travelled Berkshire to find mayors to cooperate and help, mobilize some sort of help for Germany. And Phoebe Cusden gladly offered it.
And that's significant, as you say. It's not just coming from a particular political left wing that are very sensitive and very sort of supportive. You've got here a sort of, not a retard, he was a late Royal Berkshires. He was actually, I think, working as a civil commissioner the south east of England. And then he went across to see what was going on out there, wasn't he? And he, as you rightly say, was absolutely shocked by the state of things. And this wasn't just immediately after, this was a year and a half later, and still pretty desperate. So there was him, and I think there were even, but who else was there? Bishop Chichester, I think. I've read a Hansard report that he was reporting.
I think there were more people than we now know or reckon. So Victor Gollange, for example, ran a book series called the Left Book Club. And I found a very early report on Germany, even from 46. So I think there were more people even than that, and also the press did report, and there were a lot of films, also documentary films on the situation, particularly of children of Europe. And then we shouldn't forget, the UNESCO was founded in 45, and the first thing they did was commission reports on the situation of children in war-torn Europe, but also Asia. So a lot of publications came from there, like the Book of Needs, which on 100 of pages and in 2 volumes detailed the situation with regard to education of children, accommodation, disease, and so on. So I think it was a massive effort worldwide to get an overview of what was needed and how much children in particular suffered. Obviously, Gollange was interested in the situation as a whole. He also reported about old men and young mothers trying to get their families through a tough autumn, living in a cellar, right? But again, even in Gollange's, in the darkest, we didn't say that, but he did publish all the open letters and articles he wrote a year later in a book called In Darkest Germany. So that came out in 1947. And he had a particular focus on children. And one of the shocking news he reported was in Düsseldorf, 800 children going to school every day in a massive bunker with, no light, no natural light, no good ventilation, all very narrow, definitely not healthy. These kids hardly had any shoes. Shoes was a big issue. There are lots of reports on shoes also on the German side. So Victor Gollange talks about shoes always in inverted commas. It's shoes. And he brought back a lot of photographs on shoes.
Right.
And
imagine also this was particularly the British sector was a problem. So I can imagine, well, the Soviet side we knew probably less about anyway, but it was predominantly agricultural. The southern bit that the Americans occupied, again, was largely Bavaria, Austria, was even more agricultural. And the British sector predominantly, well, it was obviously the Ruhr, Duisburg, Dusseldorf, Cologne. So you can imagine they were more sort of industrial areas, and so they suffered more because they didn't have access to the food in the same way. That's really interesting what you've told us so far. We've got this sense then, obviously, quite a few people reporting back from Germany, and people were picking it up in England as to how things were. So then you've mentioned Phoebe Cusden 2 or 3 times now, so I think it's probably right at this moment to start understanding who she was, what was her background and her motivation. Indeed, she's watching over us again, once again, this talk, listening to what we're telling people. So tell me about Phoebe.
So we are talking about her because she was mayor of Reading from November 1946 to November 1947, and then another year deputy mayor. And in that role initiated the link, the friendship with Düsseldorf and then the Reading Dusseldorf Association. But actually that's only a tiny part of her political career and her long history of social commitment. So going back does make sense because it might explain where she came from. So she was born in 1887 in Reading. And then started also in Reading as a 15-year-old at the main post office in the telegraphy department. Started to work very young, and that's one of the examples for me how modern she was, because she didn't just work at the telegraphy department, she really had a career, which was linked to other modern developments. Like she passed her civil servant exams, namely due to evening classes, which the Workers' Education Association,
still running.
Still running, put on for this new group of students from disadvantaged backgrounds or with lesser means. And then she really had a career within this telegraphy department. She reached the top job available for women at the time, which was assistant supervisor, overviewing 90 women. 60 women clerks and 30 messenger girls. And apparently she also put on classes for colleagues who wanted to qualify for a higher pay. So very modern.
Indeed.
Yeah, and then
she obviously was politically involved.
Exactly, and that also seems to have started there and then. So she originally came from a conservative Anglican background, but at the post office got to know a trade unionist and then also socialist councillor, John Rapson, who introduced her to this, to trade unionism and social injustice and so on.
Yes.
And she joined the union even before she was 18.
Golly.
I know.
This is all before the First World War even.
And that's even before the First World War, exactly.
Yeah.
And so with this new political engagement also went in unison social engagement. So again, even before the World War, she, for example, helped to organize and also raise funds for this annual poor boys holiday camp, which was put on for roughly 500 poor boys from Reading.
Yes.
He then lived in camps around Reading, I think Basildon, Wargrave, Bucklebury.
Yes, Bucklebury.
Yeah, for 10 days or so, and had activities and had enough to eat and were supervised by medical staff. So she was involved in that. And it seems that the first girl camp that was organized in 1913, so still before World War I, was organized because Phoebe Cusden pushed for extension.
As you say, way ahead of her time. Do you know what she did during the First World War?
She was a pacifist, so she did not welcome the war, unlike a lot of other people in the labor movement who said they wouldn't welcome a war, but then were still quite enthusiastic. Well, she wasn't. And she stayed a pacifist all her life, and she tried to get out of any activity that would directly involve supporting the war effort.
Yeah. So you can see that was quite contentious then. I mean, you can imagine politically, but that there was a strain of thought. But I mean, a lot of people would have said, well, it was a national effort, and you should be contributing.
Well, in Germany, where there were a few people who politically did not agree with the war effort. I mean, you have your groups of people who thought for political reasons we shouldn't support a war. And from a socialist point of view, a war meant workers kill other workers for the gain of the rich and ruling. So that was the argument, right? So in an article towards the end of the war, and she was journalistically very active, she pointed out that it's wrong how workers or common man is just treated as cannon fodder, but that counts as patriotic. Whereas when you ask the government to spend a few thousand to make the country we fight for worth living in and make your children, turn your children into decent citizens, that's stigmatized as unpatriotic.
Right.
So I think she did share a certain socialist baseline here.
Yeah, that's
but and that's of course the reason why, for example, in Germany, also some very few members of the German equivalent to the Labour Party, namely the Social Democrats, did not support the war. However, they really radicalized. These were the founding members of the German Communist Party.
Right.
Whereas Phoebe Cusden obviously did not go that
she didn't go
step.
radically hard left.
So she had, for a German, a very interesting combination, because I think her socialist convictions were merged with basic Christian principles. She was really deeply rooted in the principal ideals of Christianity. And I think she regarded socialism, at least for a while, as a sort of natural successor.
And that was completely out of line with a lot of thinking at the time. Okay, so that was the end. So the First World War, she got through that. We can see she started to become active, politically interested. She's writing.
Yeah.
I think she got married around this time.
Yes. So after the after World War I, she gets married in 1922, but also her political career really takes off, and these events do belong together a bit because, for example, the first post she gets is she's elected onto, the board of the Reading board of the Poor Law Guardians.
That makes sense. That's right.
And for her husband to be was also elected onto
Albert
this board.
Cusden,
Exactly. Albert Cusden in 1919.
Yeah.
So she starts to contest seats on the Reading Council.
Yeah.
She tries to win Castle Ward, that's the first one.
Yeah.
And then she also tries to win East Ward.
Right.
And she doesn't win them, but she still gets something interesting out of it because she focuses in her campaign on the new group of voters, namely women.
Who
got them exactly. Yes. So they received the right to vote in 1918. Well, obviously only women over 30 and with a bit of property or a husband with a bit of property.
Yeah.
And so she and her campaign team go around to check out who do these new voters vote for? What do they think? What are their political convictions?
Yeah.
Do they vote like their husbands tell them or not?
Yeah.
And so they still come back with a lot of interesting insights. And she then starts the Reading Women Labour Party, which offers and that's very successful apparently, and that offers a forum for women to get involved, to develop political perspectives and outlook, to get a better understanding, and they organize talks and debates.
Okay, so we've seen that she's obviously building up a bit of political reputation here in Reading. Do we know if she stood for a parliamentary seat?
So she did once in one of the early 20s general elections.
Yeah.
She was the candidate for South Oxfordshire, so it was.
I
know, and I think they all knew she wouldn't win the seat because Labour didn't stand a chance. In South Oxfordshire. Yeah. But I quite like the spirit of the campaign.
Exactly.
So, and one of the women on the team said that they wanted to flutter the vulgar complacency of the many desirable mansions.
Yes.
So that was quite
so there was a character,
spirit.
I think a later generation, a lady called Barbara Castle. It sounds to me a little bit like her, and very feisty, determined, actually just not going to let these chaps sort of push around. Do you know what she got up to during the Second World War?
Well, so she won a councillor seat in 1931, and that's Battle Ward, and then she remained a councillor throughout the 30s and most of the 40s till 49, and so I think she just did regular councillor work in general because she was on a whole host of committees and subcommittees, from health and education and maternity, also housing and town planning, which I find quite interesting. So Phoebe Cusden and her husband, and probably Labour as a whole, had housing in the 20s and 30s really high on the agenda, and the issues were overcrowding, also affordable housing. And then of course there were still a lot of slums in Reading at the time. And that's also the period where the slums are being pulled down and replaced by better housing estates. And I was quite intrigued to find that some were modeled on the Garden City model from, so Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea. Yeah. Apparently, in parts of Tilehurst and Upshinfield Road, that was tried to be replicated, at least in parts.
Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, so we've got an idea of Phoebe. Then that's really interesting. It's the first time I've really heard how her characters and explained so much as to her response. So we've got people reporting back from Germany. She obviously is very receptive to that messaging, and yet we're very conscious also that Britain in '46 was in pretty dreadful states ourselves. So not really. Obviously, a number of people weren't necessarily willing to help the former enemy, and frankly, a lot of them couldn't. But despite that, tell us how Phoebe, particularly, and then Reading responded to the call for aid.
So, as you said, Britain wasn't exactly well off, and I think Phoebe Cusden and Reading as a whole reacted admirably. So we mentioned the visit of Major General Collins, and what Phoebe Cusden did is she started the Christmas appeal, or the Mayor's winter collection, by advertising in a local paper in November, asking people from Reading to donate for the suffering children in Germany, in the British occupied zone, and to donate food and toys and clothes. And then she invited both the people we mentioned already, Gollanch and Collins, to come to speak in Reading Town Hall. Apparently the town hall was packed. People were interested and sympathetic, and Collins came with a bag of shoes. So there's the shoe issue again, which he had collected among his friends. And so, leading by example, he donated this bag of shoes to the collection, to the winter collection. And I think a lot of people must have donated, because by January '47, they had a good sum of cash. I think £80. They had almost 500 kilos of food, and they had several bags of clothes and shoes to send to Germany. So that's amazing. So that collected a lot by January '47. I think they had a cash sum of £80. They had half a ton of food. And then they also had several sacks of clothes and shoes, all to be sent to Germany.
That made its way out there. Okay, excellent. So that was the initial response. And then what else then started to happen after that?
So it seems that after the successful appeal, Phoebe Cusden started thinking about linking up with an organization, possibly a school, and then a whole town. And so she contacted the Ministry of German Affairs and the Regional Commissioner of North Rhine-Westphalia in Düsseldorf. And the British government had changed its approach to the occupation by that point, and generally cooperation and personal contacts and friendships were actually supported. So her suggestion of twinning, linking up, was warmly welcomed, and that's how it started.
That's the actual genesis of it. So that's quite unusual, isn't it? Because I think at that time, any town, any country, the idea of two towns sort of having a relationship must have been a pretty rare thing.
Well, I think you did have twinnings, but not necessarily with the enemy nation. So I think that was really quite new.
And as you say, she then would like the idea of a relationship with a particular town. Dusseldorf was the capital of North Rhine-Westphalia. It would sort of make reasonable sense that
and
would be
also the
relationship.
people she asked, like the regional commissioner, obviously had the headquarters. Exactly. So, and then she went to Dusseldorf in August '47 for a week, and I think she saw everything: schools, hospitals, shelters, emergency accommodation, police force, really the whole program. And in the end, they had a conference with the city's officials.
Right.
And she reported back on this conference, and what they discussed was cooperation and also exchange. So already then they discussed school exchange, sending kids from Düsseldorf to Reading. But this was then already part of a wider program. So the people from Düsseldorf ask about cooperation on the level of administration, local government, exchanges of experience, getting organizations as well as individuals in touch, getting them to correspond. They ask for books and newspapers and magazines to get a different view on the world from outside the German bubble, so it was a bigger program right from the start.
Yes, and again, to run back to our first talk, it was incredible how initially there was non-fraternisation, and how very quickly, at the very junior level, people wanted to engage. There was a tremendous affinity, and I think we all realised that we actually would have got on very well, which was very impressive. And so we've got the idea of aid going, and the idea of the initial relationship. And then I think, again, particularly the theme was the children, and the idea that they were the innocents in all this. They had weren't complicit in what had happened in the war. And I think we have the first instance then of her suggesting that children come to Reading. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, so that's even before the Christmas appeal, right? So right after the war, she reestablishes the local branch of Save the Children. And they, of course, also pay for the first exchange, or actual exchange with Düsseldorf. So that's an organization that goes back to the end of World War I. So this whole issue of children and supporting children in war situations or the aftermath of war goes back to then. And that was an organization founded in London in 1919 by two English women. And what is really interesting is that from the beginning, they did not just want to help suffering children in general, but they explicitly included enemy children even then. So they wanted to help children in Germany and Austria who suffered because of the Allied blockade. So Phoebe Cusden knew about this, re-established a local branch in Reading, but also still in 45, in autumn 45, there seemed to have been discussions about this in the press. So in the Berkshire Record Office, there are two letters Phoebe Cusden wrote, one to Sir Harold Nicholson, the diplomat, and he must have written in his weekly column in The Spectator about the necessity to provide means for the children of the suffering children of the displaced people of Germany. And she replied saying, yes, I welcome that sentiment. And then there's another letter written to the editor, I think, of The Guardian, on the occasion of an appeal to adopt enemy children. And again, she writes and says, I'm sure there are many people in this country who would be willing to take in these suffering children if they knew how much and in what dire straits these kids are, and would be happy to take them, receive them in their homes, and look after them until they can return to their own country and conditions have improved. And in that letter, she stresses again, because these suffering children, unfortunate children, are not responsible for what the Nazis did. So that's really even before this.
So you're saying that the children coming to Reading were preceded the Winter Appeal?
No, just the idea to help and focus help on children.
Yeah.
And of course, there's quite a history of helping children. So as we said, Save the Children was founded in 1919. But even after that, there were so many children relief programs that Phoebe Cusden knew of or could have known of. So, well, obviously one of those relief programs was the Poor Boys Holiday Camp, which we mentioned earlier. But there are others. So during, for example, the general strike in 1926, when the coal miners went on strike in protest of wages going down and all that, Reading was in support of the strike, and they adopted 2 Welsh mining villages, and that meant they invited 70 children from these villages to Reading to stay with families and get, be safe, be cared for, have enough to eat, and so on. So that's another instance of
very interesting. So what you're telling us is that it wasn't a sort of standout, unusual event, that the idea of involving children in the aid. This was part of a sort of a strand of behaviour that was going on for many years before, right up to the First World War and beyond.
Well,
and that's sort of consistent with that stream of thinking at the time, which I think a lot of people probably are at least aware of.
Well, yes, and I mean, there are obviously very famous examples, like the Kindertransporter. I don't know whether Reading or Reading family was involved, but that meant European children from Jewish families came to Britain to be taken into families and be helped. Then there was the Spanish Civil War, and a lot of children from the Basque region, to be safe, were brought to other European countries who were willing to take them. And I think Britain took 4,000 of these children, who were then distributed into smaller colonies, as it were. And though there wasn't a colony in Reading, there were 2 in Newbury and Maidenhead. And the Berkshire Record Office holds a picture of a May Day celebration in Reading with a group of these children visiting. So people will have known about them. There were the children evacuees from London. Reading was a receiving town. And Phoebe Cusden helped with that. She tried or helped to set up a hospital for traumatized evacuees. So yes, I think it's a wider context. And last but not least,
I thought it was a pause moment.
Well, it is a pause, but it's interesting
last but not least,
she also got this information by, I think we mentioned her earlier, this woman working for the British Red Cross.
Yes, you said Susanna.
Susie Skevington. And I don't know how Phoebe Cusden knew her, but this woman wrote a long letter about the situation in Dusseldorf. And the first part of the letter details Skevington's own involvement with another big relief program, Operation Shamrock, in which 400 something children, mostly German but not exclusively, were sent from the continent to the Republic of Ireland to stay with receiving families there for up to 3 years. So that's a long time.
That interesting stuff. That. So then we start to see the evolution of a relationship, and I think exchanges next.
So after the visit, where they started discussing how to arrange children coming to Reading, the other way around. Phoebe Cusden starts to organize this, and what they do is they advertise it in the local paper. Who would like to take in a German child for 3 months? And initially the idea was to get the children over for the winter months, because these were the hardest for German children at the time. And this doesn't work out logistically. It's too difficult. So the first children come in April, in the spring of 48.
Right.
They're now 48.
Yeah.
And it's 6 children. So the advertising in the paper got replies. 6 children from Dusseldorf come here and stay with the families for 3 months. They go with the family's kids to the schools, and the 2 schools I know were Reading Boys and Kendrick.
Right.
And they come paid by Save the Children.
Yeah.
So they give the money for the travel.
Yes.
And then that is very successful, and they want to repeat it the year after.
I see. So it became an annual event.
And that seems to be more tricky. Because by then people are a bit tired. And even though Reading behaved admirably and gave and donated and welcomed, they don't feel they can just advertise again. They also don't want to go from door to door and ask for donations and we'll pay. So this is a bit of a challenge. So what they do is they organize fundraising events. And it's, again, very different groups actually give money. So there's a fundraising event organized by Progress Theatre, and then some churches, but also the trade unions, so everybody gives some money. And then they ask schools whether families, of kids in the schools would be interested in taking in children. And that is a big success. And the school that returns most yeses is Alfred Sutton, Wokingham Road. At the time, not a primary, so a secondary modern. And I think 23 people say, we're happy to do it. And then it can go ahead. And this time, 31 children come.
It's a fair number.
So it really increased in a number.
Right.
And again, a success. And in the Berkshire Record Office, you have a lovely, it's not really a diary, it's because it's retrospectively written, but it comes along like a little diary by one of the girls from Düsseldorf, Hildegard Stephan, who was 13 at the time. And she wrote about the journey and what she did and her family. So she went to Alfred Sutton and lived near Alfred Sutton.
Right.
She called it, it's not the center of Reading, it's more the margins. And she must have had a lovely family, the Openshaws, who took her to their summer house at the coast. And she said she always wanted to stay on a beach, and she enjoyed it massively. Reporting back also on the school day, what they enjoyed cooking most, not surprisingly.
This book's available still, people can read it or see it?
It's available in the Berkshire Record Office. I know there's a translation because,
of course, in German.
But I don't think it's been published.
Right,
maybe
that's a
that's
job
a
for us.
project.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I believe also, I think you mentioned some time ago, the idea of her husband having quite an influence on particular German relationship. Can you sort of elaborate on that?
So yes, I think we said she married in 1922 Albert Cusden, who himself has quite an interesting history, and he seems to have been the Germanophile in the family, because he and his brothers had gone out to Germany before World War One to set up language schools, and then war broke out, and they were interned as British nationals, as near Berlin, well, now Berlin, and an internment camp, British internment camp, in Ruhleben, where they spent the 4 years.
The entire First War, gosh.
And you would have thought this just anti-German
exactly.
But maybe he was a passionate socialist and labor man, so maybe due to the way the war ended, it didn't, because in Germany the war ended basically with a revolution.
Yeah.
With soldiers refusing to go on fighting at a moment where the war was so clearly lost, and turning their weapons against their superiors.
It's a bit like the Russian Revolution almost.
And apparently that's what happened in the internment camp as well. So they were liberated by their guards, turning the other way. Yeah. And in Germany, this ended with the abdication of the emperor and the end of the monarchy and the proclamation of the republic. And Albert Cusden witnessed this and seemed to have been quite enthusitic about this.
So he wrote about it, we know about it.
Exactly.
Interesting, fairly unusual British experience and recollection of that whole period.
But he was a socialist as well, so maybe not so
okay, so he persuades Phoebe that these Germans are quite decent people really, and quite a few socialists and so on.
And then the interest and sympathy with Germans found all sorts of outlets, so not just the RDA, but during the war, or we should say when Hitler came to power, they seem to have helped and welcomed German refugees. But then also they looked after German prisoners of war and interned in Spencer's Wood.
Yes.
So they put on activities for them, and Phoebe Cusden also seems to have helped them when they either couldn't return to the Germany they wanted, or to the part of Germany they wanted to, or they couldn't return at all because they came from parts that were not German anymore.
Of course.
So it was
interesting. That was this fascinating couple as well. Obviously, that they were exactly the right people. Which you can just imagine. When you start to understand all this, you can understand why we end up with this
sort of relationship. And they had a project together. They edited the Labour newspaper for Reading and published it for almost 30 years, from 1924 to 52. The Reading Citizen.
Okay.
And Phoebe Cusden seems to have been in charge of the editing. But she then also wrote stuff for the paper.
And as we draw towards conclusion, can you tell us a bit about her later life? What did she do after this sort of most significant point, from our perspective, this very significant period, what happened later on?
So she lost her seat as councillor in 49.
Oh dear, right.
But she remained active. So she got involved with the peace movement and anti-nuclear protest, and returned to the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, which I think she'd been in contact with already in World War I, because they were also pacifist. And she became the editor of their British magazine. So remained active.
Very active, haven't they?
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I mean, she did other things. She sat as a representative of the town on the university board. She
was honoured, I think, wasn't she?
She was. She from the university she got an honorary doctorate in 1976. But she also got an MBE in 51, I think.
Gosh, yes. And then she died when?
In 81.
Okay. So just a bit before my time.
A long, really full and active life.
Gosh, significant. Good. Okay, well, I think, Ute, thank you very much for that. I think you've done really what I hope you were going to do, which was not just tell us all about Phoebe Cusden, which I think I've learned an awful lot more about her life. And of course, it all starts to make sense as to how she sort of created this thing and started moving, not just on her own, actually, obviously with her husband, but what you've done, which I hoped you were going to do, which is just to broaden the context and really explain to us that this wasn't a sort of unique standalone act. It was within the context, the broader sort of movements, the Spanish Civil. We mentioned the First War, the Spanish Civil War, and this idea of helping people, but particularly also helping children. So thank you very much for doing that. Really appreciate it, and hope you enjoyed that and learned as well as I did. Thank you.